Hey there everybody, it's your favorite soon-to-be object of hatred, Hearth Guy! Holy crap! After the successful second part of my little series on bosses that we don't treat properly, huge thanks to all of you by the way, I've returned to finish off this with the most controversial of possible continuations. Overrated Bosses, aka a quick way to get the wrong kind of publicity. Now, obviously opinions are subjective and all that jazz, but my opinions are the right ones, and that's why you're here. Okay, so I just want to make it clear that just because I put a boss on this list doesn't mean I dislike it, or even the character of the boss itself. Some can be very good characters, which can actually lead to people's views on the boss being a bit skewed. It's time to bring some of these bosses back down to reality, taking off the rose-tinted glasses and seeing just who is actually deserving of being called a good boss or not. Naturally, not every boss here is necessarily a bad boss either. They just aren't as deserving of the hype they get. That's a real core theme of this list. Just because something's overrated doesn't mean it's bad, just that, at least for me, it gets more praise than I feel is warranted, or its bad qualities get too often ignored. What is overrated can be debated, and if you disagree or have a different boss you think deserves to be here, let me know down in the comments. But without any further ado, let's burn down every non-existent bridge as I count down the top 5 overrated bosses in video games. The lands between. Isn't it just domestic? Filled with some of the roughest, toughest, buffest world-ending threats that are 100% going to curb stomp you and look good while doing it. We have Margit the Fell King, Radon, Conqueror of the Stars, Malenia, Blade of Mikola, Malenia, Blade of Mikola, Malenia, Blade of Mikola. Each and every one of these exudes authority and power, excluding the 4 dozen random enemies that are given the title of boss. However, there is one that just doesn't fit in amongst the likes of Godric. In the center of Liurnia is the now decrepit kingdom of Caria and the silent academy of Raya Lucaria, and in the highest precipice, inside the central library is the Queen of Caria, Renala of the Full Moon. I hope you're ready to smack some kids. More than likely to be the second Great Rune boss on your playthrough, the route to Renala is an obtuse one that leads you through the dilapidated Raya Lucaria, with each step building up to the library. Before entering, you can learn about how Radagon, the champion of the Golden Auror, married and eventually abandoned the Queen of Caria, leaving her heartbroken and despondent. Locked up in the Grand Library and left with a Great Rune, it's up to you to track her down and claim it. Like most Legacy dungeons, the areas in it act as a reflection of the bosses that are housed within, and the story of Raya Lucaria speaks of a moment trapped in time, as Renala and the school itself tries to ignore the world around them. Unfortunately, that same attitude is brought to the first phase of the Queen of Caria's fight. Renala floats around as you have to search out for a specific enemy to kill that damages the bubble keeping her up. Once she's knocked down, you beat the ever-loving crap out of her as she just sits there. However, one epic transition later and Rani, daughter of Renala, manifests an illusion of her mother in her prime, in what has to be the best boss arena in the entire game. The dark ocean under the pale moonlight which complements the light blues of Renala's magic is just so good. Too bad the boss is still painfully easy. In a close-range fight, Renala folds like wet tissue paper, and considering how many people playing this game are going to be using melee weapons, that can create a bit of dissonance in what is presented and what is delivered. In fairness, Renala has several means of getting you to back off or to otherwise make distance between you. But they don't really solve the greater issue. Not to mention, it's so easy to stagger her once you get close enough, she doesn't get the chance to actually show off the magic that is her main selling point. Or some spells just fly right over your head when you're in close. That said, I don't think Renala is a terrible boss, thanks to all the spectacle built into her encounter, as well as the fact that, for a magic build, she can be a real roadblock. Her summons, if you get caught in a bad spot, can be really challenging to focus on while Renala's firing magic at you. Not to mention, some of her summons can really come out of nowhere to surprise you and support Renala, and if she's too far away, she can bombard you repeatedly as you're trying to move in. However, unless your primary form of damage is magic, or you're just really bad at aiming, Renala will likely be the easiest major boss you encounter as you journey through the lands between. At least she gives you the power of respecking afterwards. That's a prize that makes it all worth it.
Little Rani,
Anyone who's been around long enough knows that I have a bit of a soft spot for Xenoblade. It's my favorite gaming franchise, with Xenoblade Chronicles 3 battling it out with Hollow Knight for my favorite game of all time, just about every time I sit down to think about it. However, Xenoblade 2 is easily the most contentious Xenoblade game for me, because A, I haven't played X, and B, it can be a bit jarring going from Xenoblade 1 to 2. Suffice to say, the combat was one of the reasons for that. While I now consider it to be perhaps the best in the franchise, even better than 3's at times, the learning curve is steep with this one, due to poor tutorials and difficulty spikes placed at points where you likely still haven't gotten the hang of everything. Once you do understand it, it quickly becomes immensely satisfying to pull off combos and chain attacks, especially during boss fights. Xenoblade 2 has plenty of boss fights, many of which have their fair share of drawbacks or critics, but the one that always baffled me, as I never seem to hear any detractors to it, was the final boss itself, Artifice Ion. To be as spoiler-free as I can be, because, well, duh, Artifice Ion is a world-ending superweapon that the primary antagonist, Malos, has finally gotten his hands on, and is using to direct an army of machines to destroy the world of Alrest. Our motley crew has finally cornered Malos, who is down to his last gamble. One last fight to prove whether the world deserves to continue or not. Nihilism, thy name is Malos. Having bested Malos alone 3 times by now, twice at his full power and twice when he had help, the only natural way to escalate Malos as a final boss would be to give him an even bigger upgrade, and that is Ion. And Ion is an impressive looking upgrade, a giant dual-toned mecha that towers over the entire battlefield. However, in practice, Ion is a little more clunky to deal with. The arena is huge, so figuring out how to pull off directional attacks on the boss can be a hassle, which is a real issue when your main character, Rex, primarily uses a lot of directional-based attacks. Besides that, Ion has the irritating tendency to back out of range of your attacks, which he does after the cutscene that plays when you lower his HP by 25%. Despite its size and look, Ion doesn't have a lot of dynamic movements, usually having very static animations when it's using its abilities or doing its basic attacks. Said abilities are good for the boss, such as when he lowers blade affinity. He also has an insta-kill move that he charges up once you reach a certain percentage of his health, which does add a bit of tension, but seeing his chain attacks stop time entirely, it can be somewhat trivialized. Compare this, though, to the final bosses of the other Xenoblade games, which both had a lot of things going on. Meanwhile, the most Ion ever does to spice things up is back off and summon help, and then wait a minute before bothering to enter the fight himself again. And while those bosses had multiple phases to help build the challenge and grandiose nature of the final battle, Ion only really has the one. In fact, time your chain attack right and you can skip most of his mechanics because you melt his HP that fast. Overall, while Malos is one of my favorite antagonists, and many of Xenoblade 2's boss fights introduce the right mix of challenge and enjoyable gameplay, Ion failed to hit that spectacular high that it should have. Unlike most good final bosses, it didn't properly feel like we were applying everything we'd learned up to until this point. Instead, it felt like Ion was a marginally showier kaiju fight. Luckily, Torna went and did it right, as it usually does.
Just in time for the final act, boy. I've saved you the best seats in the house.
You know, as this list goes on, I become increasingly more and more aware of how likely it is that I'm going to make many people angry. Oh well, let's talk Persona 5! Among the bosses of Persona 5, I'm generally hard-pressed to find a boss that doesn't get pretty much exactly what they deserve within the Persona community. Okumura is hated, Cheeto is pretty cool, and Akechi is liked by everyone but me. Okay. Before you torch me, this has nothing to do with Akechi as a character, so back off. Now, how about his boss fights? Well, your first chance to duel him is technically an optional 1v1 during his Confidant. That's not really the one I'm talking about. Oh, and by the way, massive spoilers. If there's any game I need to say that for, it's this one. The boss fight I'm referring to is the one you have against him in Shido's palace, where he ambushes you after initially believing he'd killed you. Long story, as I'm sure you know. After Robbie Daymond earns his paycheck and Akechi loses his marbles, we transition into one of the two Persona user fights in the game. This is definitely the lesser of the two. Right off the bat, Akechi sends two shadows at you and throws them into a berserker rage, lowering their defense and increasing their attack, which would be all well and good if you didn't always get the first turn in this game, and by the time you roll around to Shido's palace, if you don't have at least one overpowered persona, you're either challenging yourself or doing something wrong. Then, those same enemies spend their turns casting the same effect on themselves, further lowering their defenses and increasing their attack power. Attack power that doesn't matter when you've already gotten their HP down by half or more. After that, Akechi will jump in a fight that's basically just a rehash of his fight during his confidant, only now you have 3 others helping you, meaning that's over so fast that I apparently forgot to record any clips of the fight itself. Oops. But that's not the important part. After you beat him the first time, Akechi somehow loses it even further and transforms into his black mask form with his stronger persona, Loki. Now admittedly, it does get better from here. Sort of. Akechi is able to mitigate the numbers advantage we have by taking 2 actions a turn. He can erect barriers that allow him to reflect physical or magical attacks, and he can cast the same desperation ability that he could on the shadows, which is actually not as detrimental because of the aforementioned barriers. However, his limits become clearer as the fight progresses. RNG can screw with you hard, but most of the time nothing Akechi throws at you will be impossible to deal with. Even if one party member goes down, you should have plenty of items and skills to revive them quickly. As the fight continues, Akechi starts pulling out almighty damage, which is a genuine threat since there's no way to defend against it except general buffing of defenses or the same reflective barriers that he has. However, he also begins focusing exclusively on Joker at certain parts, meaning that you can very easily prepare for whatever attack he's going to throw at you. In short, Persona 5 Royal gives you all the tools needed to easily overcome Akechi well before he ever shows up. And it's not because of natural challenge or scaling, but A, because Persona 5 Royal has terrible difficulty balance, and B, because Akechi feels less like you're fighting a boss that's meant to challenge your knowledge of the game, and more like you're just putting a raging dog out of his misery. And maybe that's the point. I doubt it, but maybe. Even so, it doesn't make it a compelling or generally enjoyable boss fight.
You're so lucky. Lucky to be surrounded by teammates who acknowledge you.
Dragon Age, oh Dragon Age. You and I have such a mixed relationship. For every high, there is an abysmal low. For every Alistair and Cassandra, you have a Sebastian, or, well, Sebastian. Dragon Age bosses naturally follow a similar trend of sporadic quality. The Envy Demon kept you on your toes with its constant appearance and disappearance. Meanwhile, the Sloth Demon's enormously long build-up made everything after just too irritating to put up with. Loghain may have been a natural and admittedly difficult solo duel for whichever character gets put up against him, but the Aeroshocks fight became a game of tag almost immediately. And while Dragon Age DLCs can have some pretty enjoyable bosses, they can also have not that. In the words of my sister, who did this fight 4 months ago during her first playthrough of the game, you aren't even told what to do outright. Everyone keeps walking into hazards, so you're just running around the arena as everyone's dying of fire as you're trying to figure out what to do. And he's like spouting emo nonsense, and it's like, who cares? Can you not right now? I just got through 3 hours of the most exhausting, trauma-inducing DLC of my life, and I do not need this nonsense. A real wordsmith. During the long journey up an ancient prison that is powered and sealed by the blood of our main character, Hawk, we hear about an old master named Corypheus that influences the minds of those nearby and is trying to break out. After several traps, puzzles, and this try-hard Yoda man, we finally reach the top of the prison and open it up to slay this malevolent force, where we meet Corypheus, one of the original Darkspawn who broke into the Golden City and caused the dreaded blight that was the crux of the original game. So yeah, he's kind of a big deal. Corypheus' main mechanic is that when his health drops below a certain amount, he'll run away to the pedestal in the center and start altering the terrain as you have to drag your party members to 4 separate points, kill the enemies that spawn in, activate something, and then you can keep fighting him. Corypheus does this, I kid you not, 3 separate times, with each successive runaround becoming more tedious and more difficult to herd your party into following you. Because if they go down, good luck getting them back up while all of this is going on. Corypheus is, at least by all appearances, an attempt to return to the more tactically minded boss fights of Dragon Age Origins. A fact that I actually appreciate, because I'd been missing that in Dragon Age 2. However, if this is the result, I'd rather they just forget it. Instead, it comes across as a crappy MMO boss fight. As my sister once said, if you want to play League of Legends, just play League of Legends. We're only going to partially judge you. Words to live by.
Whoever you be, you owe fealty to any Magister of Tevinter. On your knees. All of you.
Saren, Mass Effect. Saren's a cool character and his story and death are cinematic. I just can't get over how bouncy this boss fight is. You spend most of the time trying to aim at him. How is this supposed to be fun? The Yellow King, Fear and Hunger. Seriously, this Ginger Griffith stand-in is built up so much, but by the time you actually end up fighting him, chances are you've beaten way tougher things than him. Not to mention, half of his little pals here don't even last 2 shots. Give me Sylvian any day. Every so often, someone has to ask themselves if they're really willing to die on a certain hill. And for me, it's this one. In Fire Emblem Three Houses, one of the worst boss fights the franchise has ever concocted is Hegemon Edelgard. Honestly, let's just tack on the Edelgard fights from Verdant Wind and Silver Snow too, since they're not much better. Edelgard is one of the main lords and, 3/4 of the time, the primary antagonist of Fire Emblem Three Houses. Edelgard is also one of the most divisive and complex characters to come out of Fire Emblem, or even gaming in general in recent years. Not the most divisive, don't get me started on Rhea, but she's a very close second. As for me, I actually like Edelgard. She's a well-written character that usually strikes the balance between hero and villain depending on where you're standing. I'm not one of those Edelgard simps that are drooling and denying she ever did anything wrong, and I'm not one of those Edelgard haters that are pretending she's actually Satan. Unlike them, I actually have media literacy. But this isn't a conversation about well-written or morally gray characters. Maybe another day. This is about boss fights, and boy are these rough. Ignoring the fact that until Fire Emblem Engage, good boss fights were the exception rather than the rule in Fire Emblem, Edelgard got the short end of the stick. Her fights in Verdant Wind and Silver Snow aren't all that spectacular, which is bogged down by the battlefield forcing you to crawl your way across the map, which discourages you from taking roundabout routes. Those problems and more are emphasized in the Hegemon Edelgard fight during Azure Moon. Now increase the amount of Agarthan troops and monsters that box you in, set you further away from the boss, put even more enemies that even if you try to avoid them, they head for you as soon as you get near the boss, and Hegemon Edelgard with the largest range out of the entire game, targeting your healers, and Dimitri, whenever she gets the chance. Now, Edelgard herself is little more than a nuisance at first, due to her inability to target the same unit twice in a row, her low accuracy, and how your heaviest hitting units will more than likely just brush off her attacks. However, you had better keep an eye on Flayn, for instance, because Edelgard will be gunning for her. The enemy density is mind-boggling, and you had better hope you've crafted your units to be as busted as possible, because otherwise there is no way you're getting anywhere close to the boss before you do. And even if you do get close, if you didn't clear out the enemies in the other areas, they'll start closing in and swarm you almost immediately. Heaven help you if you're playing on Classic, cause getting through with no deaths will take RNG being on your side more than any strategy, which is part of the problem. If your strategy game feels less like you're failing due to poor strategy and more due to poor RNG or unfair enemy density, then you haven't made a very good strategy game. If you have to abuse rewind time to narrowly avoid dying repeatedly, not because you made a bad plan, but because you have to rely on not getting hit by Hegemon Edelgard's fastball special, then you need to rethink the gameplay in your game. At least I can be serenaded by Apex of the World the whole time. That'll take my mind off of it. For now.
The past underfoot and move onward to a brighter tomorrow.
With that, I'll close off this little mini-series of countdowns to say, you can enjoy whatever you like. No one can stop you. Even if what you like is, in many ways, objectively bad, your experiences and your reasons for enjoying something are your own. If you still love a boss fight on this list, more power to you. I'm happy for you. If you dislike any of the bosses on this or my previous countdowns, that's your right too. Anyone who says otherwise is, well, being crazy. The genuine quality of something doesn't have to be equivalent to your enjoyment of it. There's a reason people like things that I unabashedly hate, and while I may not understand why people like it, no one can force you to think a certain way. Least of all a random voice in the void like me. Like, comment, and subscribe, everyone. Thank you for enjoying me, thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting. See you around the hearth, folks.